Yes, if it's 6, that's not yes. Okay, welcome everybody this afternoon. I hope the microphones are not too much sort of going around. My name is Willemien Otten. I'm president of the local advocacy chapter of the AUP. We're very happy to have this event to discuss the report that is written by the Committee on Disruptive Conduct, which follows from an earlier report on free speech and an ad hoc, a report of an ad hoc committee on dissent and conduct. I will briefly introduce the speakers to you, but before I do so, I yield the floor to Corbin, who wants to make an announcement first.
I wanted to invite everyone to an event that we will be holding on May 19th from 4 to 5:30 in Rosenwald 405 called In Defense of Disruptive Conduct. There'll be a speak out and an opportunity for us to continue discussing this report and other issues involving free speech on the campus. Thanks.
Great, and now let's get underway, and we'll do so. Sorry?
Tell people there are cameras.
Yes, we will get underway, but not before I tell you that there are cameras, so I hope nobody has a problem with that, but they will not be obtrusive. So that is all fine. Thank you for letting me know. So let me introduce the panel to you. We also have name dates so you can all see them, but we're very happy to have here Professor Randall Picker from the law school, who's chair of the Committee on Disruptive Conduct. And he's really worked overtime the last few weeks. I'm very grateful that he was willing to be here for us. Next is Professor Christopher Wild in Germanic Studies, who's also a member of the Picker Committee. Then we have Professor Ken Bourne in the English Department, member of the Stone Committee on Freedom of Expression, followed by Professor Anton Ford in the Philosophy Department, and he was not on that committee. It's listed that he's a member of the AUP, but so is also Professor Warren. And then we have Alejandra Azuera, a PhD student in anthropology and member of the GSU. And finally, Everett Peltzman, a student in the college, an English major, member of U of C Resists. We've agreed to the following procedure. Every speaker will have about 5 minutes. We'll try to time it so that we can really stick to the chosen format. After that, we have a handheld microphone and we'll start the discussion, and that discussion can be, questions from the audience can be directed to all members on the panel, but also panelists can ask questions of each other. And we'll try to make sure that everybody on the panel will kind of have equal time, so that is considered important. The order that we've agreed on is the following. Professor Picker will start, as he is the chair of that committee and also maybe the most important author of the draft report on disruptive conduct. He's going to be followed by Professor Warren, who was a member of the Stone Committee on Freedom of Expression, which lies behind this committee, right? So it seems good to have some background on that. He will be followed by Professor Wild, the second member of the Picker Committee. And then we'll have Alejandra Azuero, followed by Everett Peltzman, and finally we'll have Professor Anton Ford. And the speakers are free to either come up here and make their statement or stay seated. I think all the microphones are turned on. So let me yield the floor now to Professor Picker.
Thank you. Well, thanks for organizing this. The Pickle Committee would be so much more interesting in a completely different type of undertaking. So this is a super important issue. That's why I agreed to do this. I've done a bunch of administrative stuff over the last few years at the university, and more than I think I should be doing. And where it's not so important, I would have said no. But it's important, so here we are. And I share that sense of importance with everyone we've engaged with. So we appreciate that engagement, all in good faith. We can disagree, I see friends in the room that I disagree with. I stare at Yali. But we can do this in a good way. Okay. So let me give you background. So there was a reference to the David Strauss report, which goes back to January of 2014. David's report has a discussion of protest. I think that's a great discussion. David Strauss, one of my colleagues at the law school, a great discussion of protest. Operationally, he highlighted two things. There should be revisions to Statute 21. Statute 21 is in the university statutes where disruptive conduct is defined. I didn't know that, but now I do. And then also there are on the books procedures for disruptive conduct that go back to 1970. He said that should be looked at. Okay. What happened out of that was sort of two processes. So the committee of the council, as best we can tell, drafted the revisions to Statute 21 that Strauss's committee sort of contemplated. Those were voted on by the council in May of 2014, so 3 years ago at the start of this process. And so the current language that you see there, the language about enjoyment, now we're all sort of on the same page or not, all of that goes back to the 2014 revision. So there was an earlier version in 1969 that had that language, but that wasn't in the statute again until 2014. Okay. And then the then provost sort of killed off the 1970 procedures, not recognizing that actually the statutes entrusted this to the council. And so once that was recognized, then it was thought that another committee was required. In the meantime, we had the Stone report. Ken's going to talk about that. I'm eager to hear Ken talk about that. Our committee was formed. When I sat down and talked to the then provost, Eric Isaacs, about the charge, that charge initially focused on just the disciplinary system for disruptive conduct. I said faculty members are much more interested in education than we are in discipline. Fine, happy to do this, but we need to also have an education component to that, so the charge contains that. We met with lots of people. Chris will talk through some of that. Lots of meetings across basically September with students and faculty and staff, and it's all listed in the report. Have been in front of the council 3 different times on this at various points, but we issued a report. And that report's got some framing principles in it. It's got some ideas about administration in terms of deans, free speech deans on call and the like. Educational suggestions, but the thing which has received clearly the most attention is Appendix 5, which is the disciplinary system. We've gotten comments in on that. Again, thanks for all of the engagement. We've looked at those comments. We've really spent this week drafting revisions. And I expect those revisions, given the procedures, to go out to the committee of the council, which meets Tuesday, by, if all goes well, 5 p.m. tomorrow. So that's where we are. That will then, after discussion in the committee of the council Tuesday, my expectation is it will go to the public, as it were, at least the campus public, wider, as we head into the council meeting on Tuesday, May 23rd. That's sort of where we are. Let me talk about some of the planned revisions. I'm looking at the clock. Am I okay? So let me talk about a few of the planned revisions so you can have a sense of that. I won't have time to talk about what the advantages are. The choice here for the council is whether to stay with the 1970 procedures or to adopt the new procedures. That's the choice. So we see substantial advantages over the 1970 procedures. Maybe we'll get that in questions. Let me talk about the changes, though, since I know that people will be interested in those. We've heard the comments about Statute 21. We weren't asked to look at that. We weren't asked to look at it because the council revised it 3 years ago. It would have been odd to ask us to revisit that work. But it seems clear now that people have focused on Statute 21. A lot of people don't like it. Fine. Well, that's great. Our recommendation is going to be that another committee, I cannot emphasize enough, another committee, go off and look at Statute 21. Someone else should go off and do that and report back on that. And as part of that, we have a couple of revisions to Statute 21 that we think are right, but we're going to table those. That's 5. I'll stop.
You can have part of mine.
Okay, well, that's fine. So we're going to table those. Those are gone. The confidentiality rules, I think you'll look at the next version of those and you'll still have some issues with some of them about during the proceedings, but after the proceedings, I think those will be much better. I think you'll like that. The 1970 version has a presumption of innocence. We're pulling that back in. We could have a long philosophical discussion about the importance or non-importance of that, but everyone wants it. We'll just put it in. That's easy enough to do. Critically, I think the thing that you should most focus on, because I think this is the thing that I think the central administration will go, is this okay? Is that the 1970 procedures call for the faculty members on the committee to be appointed by the president. We're going to propose that the faculty members be chosen from what we see as the most democratically elected faculty body on campus, that is the council. So it would be from the council, and then let's say the last 3 years of the council. That would give you a pool of roughly 100 people. We'll have some fancy randomization mechanism over that. So that will pull that out. There's a concern that the central administration, especially in this context, will try to protect itself. We think that's the solution to that. We're also going to try to create a trained support pool for students in this process. There's a concern that students pulled into these processes are it's a pretty intimidating process. And so to have a trained support pool, faculty members, I look around the room, I hope people will volunteer to do this. But I think that's the way to do that. There's some other changes as well. I could say more. I want to talk about what U of C Resistance said about this, but we can do that in Q&A. Thanks.
Okay, I'm, I guess, trying to do two things. One is to give briefly a kind of reflection on or some insight into the Stone Committee, as it's properly called, but also to give my reflection on it, because although I'm participating in this panel as a result of having been a member of that committee, I want to clear that my remarks here shouldn't be construed as representing the views of the committee. The report itself reflects and represents those views, and that's available. So what I want to do in some respects is to offer, in addition to some characterizations of what the committee did, some of what might be called some second thoughts, or a second thought that I have in regard to what has happened in the wake of the publication of the report, including most obviously the reason that we're here today, which is the drafting of the report of the Committee of University Discipline for Disruptive Conduct, but also the way in which the so-called Chicago principles represented in the Freedom of Expression report have now become the basis for a national discussion of freedom of speech or free speech on campus. And I should say, for faculty, we know that university governance has relied significantly on these reports that have been issued by committees constituted by the president and the provost, on which faculty participate voluntarily. As such, not all the reports result in specific changes to university statutes or policies, but they often have a kind of standing with respect to governing how members of the university will proceed in those areas that are covered by the report, so that the report on the commission by the Committee of Freedom of Expression was not expected and did not go to us dictating how particular rules ought to be interpreted directly. It was meant to be a kind of a guide, expression of values that would not do away with casuistry, necessarily to determine how each individual event ought to be decided, but to give those members of the university committee who found themselves necessarily responding to incidents some set of principles that could be invoked by way of explaining the actions that they have taken. We didn't, on my recollection, have any expectation necessarily that this report would be followed up by other reports. As such, Professor Strauss, who authored one of the ad hoc committee, was indeed a member of the Freedom of Expression Committee as well. So there hasn't been a lot of internal campus discussion. There's been some, I think, of the report on the Committee of Freedom of Expression, but there has been significant uptake outside of the university of these principles. Most recently, I think, on Tuesday of this week, the Tennessee governor, Bill Haslam, signed into law a provision requiring colleges in Tennessee to adopt broad protections of freedom of expression consistent with a landmark statement adopted in 2015 by the University of Chicago. And the language of that law, which you can find online, draws extensively from the language of the Chicago Report. I'll say I'm not surprised by it, but I guess I've been, from the outset, a little uncomfortable with the campaign mounted outside of the university, particularly by the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE, to urge universities and colleges around the country to endorse the so-called Chicago Principles, which are held to be embodied in the report. Indeed, it seems to be one of the obvious but unavoidable contradictions of such a campaign. And the statement itself lies in the tension between an assertion that the statement, on the one hand, distills principles that are distinctive to the peculiar history of the University of Chicago. And the statement indeed makes several references to the university's founding principles, including an assertion that, quote, this statement reflects the long-standing and distinctive values of the University of Chicago, on the one hand, and the idea that the principles expounded in the report are in some sense universal and should be adopted universally. This is, as I've said, contradictory to a certain extent, but the contradiction, I think, is unavoidable. Principles emerge out of the peculiarities of history, but acquire their identity as principles by virtue of some aspiration to timelessness and universality. The mere fact of trying to have principles is to be immersed in the debate about whether or not the position one is taking merely reflects the values compatible with one's own self-interests, locally felt. So this also, raises the larger question of whether, one ever really holds principles that are inconsistent with one's self-interests. But we'll have to set that aside for now. Gotta hurry here. So the president and provost accepted the report because they viewed the statement as being a good thing for the University of Chicago, specifically, and they also accepted it because they thought it was a good thing universally. Now, I've got a lot of other things I wanted to do here. I can see that I'm out of time to a certain extent. My second thought, just to sort of gesture towards it, Stanley Fish published recently a reflection in the Chronicle of Higher Education, distinguishing between a commitment to freedom of expression or freedom of speech as such and freedom of inquiry. Saying that a university's fundamental values are to freedom of inquiry, not necessarily to freedom of speech. Freedom of speech, as he says, like a Hyde Park corner, quote, where anybody can say what they want to say and there are no requirements. Freedom of inquiry is actually a principle that requires a commitment to the weighing of evidence. It's exercised by university committees, faculty operating as a community of scholars. Those two things, he says, aren't identical. I think he's right on that. I think the University of Chicago statement, and I want to say more about this and we can talk about it, works as hard as it can to identify freedom of speech with freedom of inquiry. And that seemed to be the right position to take at the time. I'm not quite so sure that it was the proper way to identify what it is we were attempting to do. The upshot of this is that our attempt to codify freedom of expression is necessarily a provisional, processual one, in which there will always going to be debate about exactly how to draw that line. With that in view, it is important that disciplinary measures arising from these principles always be, in some respect, as lenient as possible, and operating on the presumption of corrigibility, that we can get better at these kinds of responses to these particular incidents. And that, for that reason, I was concerned and have been that the urgency with which we turn to the idea that we have to have strict disciplinary responses contributes not to the furtherance of the freedom of expression, as I saw the report attempting to do, but actually may act in opposition to those principles. I can try to highlight this if it comes up in the question, but thank you.
I'll keep my remarks relatively short since Randy also used up some of my 5 minutes. he also provided you much of, sort of factual information on some of the, how, on the prehistory of the report. And I just wanted to mark a couple of sort of tonal aspects, so to say. But just like he, I'm in some sense in dialogue with many responses that we have gotten. I think over 30 responses, and we have been spending the last week and a half sort of looking at those very carefully. And you have seen already some of that work in response to these responses delineated by Randy. I just wanted to, again, stress, and I think that sometimes gets lost now, where everyone, I think there's a perception that things are being rushed right now. And, we have been working for a year, or nearly a year, and we feel we have been working actually quite hard and intensively. And we also feel, and again, it may not have worked out that way, people have not heard about it, but we also felt it was an open and transparent process. I think we at some point stopped meeting with people because we ran out of meeting with people. I talked to a lot of colleagues at the time, invited them to come. So in that sense, again, maybe we could have worked harder, but we felt we actually had solicited, quite extensive input. I also want to stress that it was a faculty-led process. One of the things that, many of the responses sort of delineate that this is sort of the administration. The committee's work was a group of faculty, and again, we may differ in certain, in positions. We may, but it's not, it's not the administration that we're necessarily representing, but our best judgment. That also then speaks to another aspect that is frequently mentioned in the responses, also in the council meeting, namely that they are punitive or vindictive. I can, in this case, only speak to myself, is that was certainly not the intention, that they are punitive or vindictive. And if we've, again, gotten sometimes the tone wrong, or that was something that I think we're more than happy to correct, but it was certainly not the intention to be punitive and vindictive. And I certainly don't share, for instance, the assessment that Jane Daly in Maroon, that the disciplinary system is by nature punitive. I would make a distinction between disciplinary and punitive, but that's maybe something that we can discuss in the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, I want to begin by saying that we salute the decision by the authors of the Picker report to withdraw revisions to Statute 21. We are convinced that, in fact, this is the first step of what should be a truly inclusive and participatory conversation about the value of dissent expressed through acts of protest and what the shape and limits of disciplinary action should be. However, we do not know enough yet about the actual content of those revisions to say that we will support them, or that in fact we agree with there being a vote by the Faculty Senate on May 23. As long as we do not have an adequate internal campus discussion, we hold that no revisions should be implemented. In fact, it is precisely in light of Professor Picker's intervention just now that today we cannot have a real conversation about the content of the report because we do not know its content. And as much as I do want to believe that, and many of you here do, that this is all being done in good faith, we know that good faith is not enough to have a realistic dialogue about disciplinary action at the University of Chicago. So my comments in some way are retrospective because they're about a version of the report to which we have responded thoughtfully and thoroughly as students and faculty working under the auspices of a coalition that goes by the name of U Chicago Resists. But I still think it's worth discussing the content of what the report first stated so that this can be the basis for future conversation. So my comments will focus on the substance. I will begin with Statute 21 and then refer to Appendix 5. And we have distributed a handout because I think part of what's interesting here is that we're dealing with multiple different versions of documents and text. And so I want to call your attention to those. As I said before, we applaud the withdrawal of proposition to amend Statute 21. However, we believe that Statute 21, in fact, should not be the only reference to disciplinary action included in university statutes. That acts of academic dishonesty or harassment, plagiarism or falsifying research are not contemplated, but only protest is in itself part of university statutes is in itself problematic and has chilling effects on free speech. We believe that Statute 21 should be removed from university statutes. We need to remember that Statute 21 does not exist in a vacuum. Much more than worried with transparency, as the Picker report suggests, as students and faculty, we need to think very carefully about the freedom we're starting from when students have already clearly expressed through the recent diversity survey that their main concern is not lack of transparency or centralization of the disciplinary system, but that homophobia, sexism, and racism have severe marginalizing effects on campus. And so I'll continue now to talk about proposals regarding Appendix 5, because it seems important that there is still an effort to bring to a vote before the Faculty Senate a revised version of the appendix. I will refer here briefly to aspects of it we deem most problematic and want to draw your attention to the second and third items on the handout we distributed. On the question of confidentiality, imposing on students the obligation to refrain from talking about a protest under investigation operates de facto as a gag order and forecloses solidarity for an act that by definition is meant to be public. The reputational harm that justifies confidentiality under Title IX is in no way comparable to disciplinary investigation for acts of protest, specifically when there is a fundamental publicness to dissent expressed through protest that does not apply to sexual abuse or sexual harassment. I want to conclude by saying that compared to the existing all-university system, Appendix 5 confidentiality trumps the presumption of innocence and the right of the student to have a public hearing contemplated in our existing system, and you can see it in the text. We are convinced there are aspects of our current disciplinary system that should be revised, and in that we share with the Picker report. However, we reject the recommendations of the report insofar as combined. Its call for centralization in practice would amount to getting rid of checks that are necessary for protests to exist on campus, while giving more power to the administration and to the police. We believe it should be faculty and students, as gathered here today, not an administration-appointed committee who, through an inclusive and participatory process, define what is the problem with the 1970s disciplinary system and how we should improve it. And so I will just say to end, again, that we think that we should have a conversation about the actual content of the Picker report. And until then, we urge members of the Faculty Senate to withhold making any decision on the implementation of these recommendations. And we invite all of those who are present here to join us on May 19th and continue the conversation of what should be one of the highest stakes reforms being discussed at the University of Chicago at the moment. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I'm going to be speaking today specifically against the Picker Report's proposals to amend the university's disciplinary system, and more broadly against the crackdown on protest and dissent here at UChicago. I'm here as a member of U of C Resists, a formation that came together in the wake of the 2016 presidential election, and of course as a member of the University of Chicago community. First of all, I want to thank the Picker Committee for hearing and taking seriously the response of the university community to their report. We welcome the changes that Professor Picker has enumerated. Nonetheless, this ought to be only the very beginning of a conversation. We must still challenge and contest the spirit of this report, symptomatic of a broader crackdown on student protest and argue against the measures that this report contains and entertains, and which, if I understand Professor Picker correctly, are very much still on the table for future committees to consider. The university's reputation as a free speech commons, which reduces freedom of expression to the exchange of ideas on a panel, is its most treasured asset. The university, in part through the Chicago Principles, has carefully curated the legacy and history of this institution to reflect this image. Tellingly, the reports that comprise the Chicago Principles often begin with a series of quotes from or tributes to past presidents of the university, as if the history of this institution belongs to or could be captured in the words of its powerful headmasters. There's an alternative history of the University of Chicago, and it belongs to the students, faculty, and staff who have lived, studied, worked, and protested on these quads. You cannot find this history in the student handbook, in the discourse around the Chicago Principles, or in letters to incoming students. But against all odds, through informal channels, publications, and self-education, students have preserved this legacy and sustained this tradition of dissent. Protest is the lifeblood of the University of Chicago. I stand in turn with my peers, past and present, who have been punished and silenced for their activism on this campus. What is this alternative history? It's the history of the 17 employees of the Quadrangle Club who walked off a busy lunch shift one afternoon in 1945 to protest the discriminatory policies of the club, which, at the time, restricted membership to white male professors. These employees certainly interfered with the enjoyment of the Quad Club's diners, which the Picker report cites as constitutive of disruptive conduct. Should they have been disciplined? It's the history of the early days of the Woodlawn Organization, a grassroots coalition resisting UChicago's urban renewal plan that succeeded in halting the university's expansion south of 61st Street. Including community members unaffiliated with the university under the umbrella of its disciplinary system, as the Picker report proposes to do, would have given the university the means to suppress and stifle the Woodlawn Organization's campaign 50 years ago. It's the history of the anti-draft movements of the late 1960s that featured sit-ins, hunger strikes, and demonstrations. What would have been the prospects for a sustained anti-draft movement spanning many years if the administration treated disruptive conduct based on an aggregation across incidents, putting students under constant surveillance? It's the history of the students who defended Professor Marlene Dixon by occupying the admin building after she was fired for her leftist politics in 1969. They certainly faced harsh consequences for their actions at the time. But would they have had their chance to stand in solidarity with Professor Dixon in the first place if free speech deans on call and UCPD officers had advance authorization to intervene? Of course, this alternative history is still being written. From 2010 to 2015, community members and students inheriting, participating in, and informed by this alternative history advocated for the construction of a trauma center at the University of Chicago Medical Center. When administrators refused to meet with the Trauma Center Coalition, students and community members staged peaceful sit-ins, lockdowns of construction sites, and marches through campus. Their tireless efforts, their disruptive conduct, won a trauma center for the south side of Chicago. If we truly appreciate the people's history of the University of Chicago, we will, instead of criminalizing disruptive conduct, welcome and facilitate protests and public demonstrations as essential to the health, the growth, and the future of this community. Thank you.
The conventional way of framing the issues surrounding the Picker report would have us consider the report in the context of certain recent incidents at Middlebury and Oberlin and Yale and Berkeley. I'd like to urge the members of the Council of the Senate to consider the matter before them in a broader political context. A recent UN report describes what it calls an alarming and undemocratic trend in this country. In the last 8 months, more than 20 states have proposed legislation that aims to curb protest. The Arizona Senate passed a bill allowing officials to seize the assets of those who either plan or participate in protests in which property is damaged, even if the damage is caused by one person or even if it's caused by an opposing group. There's a bill under consideration in Florida now that it would exempt drivers from liability for unintentionally harming or even killing a protester who is blocking the road. A proposed bill in Minnesota would authorize cities to charge protesters for police services if they're convicted of illegal assembly. According to the UN, the trend is, quote, incompatible with U.S. obligations under international human rights law. The suppression of protests nationally is also taking place on university campuses. At the same time that this university is proposing to introduce a more severe regime of discipline on student protesters, Republican lawmakers in Wisconsin are sponsoring a bill that would require state universities to do the same. The proposed bill would require that state universities adopt a posture of official neutrality on all matters of public controversy. It would enable outside speakers to sue the University of Wisconsin when they felt that their free speech rights had been violated on campus, and it would create a council of university administrators who were responsible for reporting the outcomes of disciplinary proceedings to these politicians. And here's where we come in. The Wisconsin bill is based on model legislation drafted by the Goldwater Institute, a right-wing Arizona think tank. In its executive summary of the model legislation, the Goldwater Institute identifies three sources of inspiration: Yale's 1974 Woodward Report, the University of Chicago's 1967 Calvin Report, and the University of Chicago's 2015 Stone Report. It's not just happening in Wisconsin either. Bills based on the same model legislation, modeled, again, on our reports, have also been introduced in North Carolina, Colorado, Tennessee, and Illinois. Through its production of committee reports, the University of Chicago is making itself an intellectual armory. It's forging ideological weapons that are then being used nationwide to attack democratic rights and academic freedom. Before we produce another such weapon, we need urgently to stop and think about what we're doing. The Picker Report provides for the enforcement of the Chicago principles. What are these principles? Well, whatever they are, they've never been subjected to public scrutiny here. It might come as a surprise to the people who have heard President Zimmer speak, but the Stone Report of 2015 has no legitimate claim to represent the judgment of the faculty. The committee that produced that report was appointed by the president. It was not elected by us. And when the report was finished, no one asked us what we thought of it. The Council of the Senate never ratified it. The principles enshrined in the Stone Report and in President Zimmer's speeches have never been affirmed by the faculty. And unless and until we affirm those principles, all discussion of their enforcement should stop. The question whether to affirm the principles is prior, and obviously prior, to the question how we ought to enforce them. And we have never discussed the prior question. So, should we affirm the Chicago principles? Obviously, I wouldn't be raising the question if I thought the answer was yes. But just as obviously, there's not time to really get into it here. I'll just try to give a schematic sense of what I think is one of the things that I think is problematic about them, and that makes them unsuited to protecting the freedom of expression of students, staff, and faculty on campus. Primarily, it's that the purpose of those principles is not to protect the freedom of expression of the students, staff, and faculty on campus. That's not its animating concern, in fact. The animating concern of the Stone Report is to protect the expression of those who visit campus. The entire document builds to the claim, the final sentence of the penultimate paragraph, that the University of Chicago has a solemn duty to protect the speech of visitors. So it's about freedom of expression, but the freedom of expression that it's about is not ours. This is pretty explicit in the framing principles of the Picker Report. One of them states, quote, disruptive conduct may itself be a form of speech, but that does not mean it is a protected form of speech. So where there's a conflict between the speech of a student and that of a visitor, such that the university must decide which speech to protect, the university sides with the visitor, not with the student, as a matter of principle. I'll give one illustration to show what I think one would have to talk about instead of discipline if one wanted to talk about protecting the speech and expression of student, staff, and faculty. A reporter from the Maroon contacted me earlier this week to talk about the secret free speech conference that was held a little while ago. And in contacting me, the reporter made it known that I was in fact not the first person that he had approached. The first person that the reporter had approached was an assistant professor, somebody without tenure. And that professor declined to speak on the record for fear of retribution. So think about that. Untenured professors at this university are afraid to speak their minds on the record about freedom of speech, the topic of this panel. Forget about them participating in disruptive protest or undisruptive protest. They're afraid to say what they think. And what's worse, it's for good reason. But now put that in perspective, because, tenure-track professors are among the most protected people on campus. What about the non-tenure track faculty who don't have the protection of a union, or the graduate students who recently filed for a union, but who've been opposed by the administration every step of the way, or the library workers who recently filed for a union as well, or the security guards? If you don't have a union or tenure on this campus, then you work under the constant threat of being fired for expressing your opinion. One thing that chills speech is the threat of losing health care. Job security is a free speech issue, so tenure and unionization are free speech issues. These are the kind of issues that we would have to pay attention to if we were concerned with the free expression of the students, staff, and faculty on this campus, and not on that of the very important people who like to visit here.
Thank you to all the panelists, also for staying more or less on schedule. That was a good job. So we're now going to throw it open. We can do two things, or different things. We have a handheld microphone, which we can circulate. People are closer to the lectern and can also come up here and address their question to probably a particular panelist, but if you have more in mind too, you can probably all see their names or know them. So let me just invite the first person to want to ask a question, and we can bring you the microphone. Yes.
Thank you all for doing this. My name is Eric Powell. I'm a PhD candidate in English and a member of Graduate Students United and UFC Resist. I just wanted to say a few words about why I think that the dialogue about this has been inadequate, and why some of us have, myself included, have the perception that the administration is trying to force this through without adequate dialogue. So you can look, I believe it's Appendix 4 of the report. There's a list of everyone you all met with, correct? Appendix 4. So everybody can look at this, right? There's one graduate student. There's 5 or 6 undergraduates. There's one town hall, which I was at in October of last year. There were maybe 10 students there. It was very poorly advertised, which is why there was no one there. And as we all know, if the administration really wants to advertise something, they can do so, as they have been with the Graduate Student Union recently, sending email after email to the entire community. Right? So from that period, when there was that town hall in 2016 in October, until the report came out, I saw nothing about it. Right? And this was prior to the report being written, so it was just a sort of unguided discussion about the principles being considered, right? The issues under consideration, right? So that is to say that I think an adequate conversation would have had obviously more input from, the other thing I'll say is that I think there were maybe 7 or 8 non-administrative faculty members that are on that list in Appendix 4 as well, right? So to me, this is, on the face of it, an inadequate discussion with the community here at the University of Chicago, right? And so it has the appearance, I think, of not a discussion about this report open to the community, but to the appearance of something that the administration just wanted to sort of let fly under the radar and pass without too much pushback, right? Yeah, so I'll stop there. It's not really a question, but I invite those on the committee to respond to this if you would like to.
Do you want to?
So, I mean, I'm going to be frank. I mean, we're trying to reach as many. I'll be honest that, of course, we as individual committee members didn't, so to say, close the feedback loop and made sure and sort of that it reached everyone. But as I said, I mean, one of the things that we were actually disappointed by the turnout, by the meeting that you were there. I thought we had a good conversation, and if there would have been more turnout, and I cannot, I can't judge, since I'm also, you're then part of a bubble, I can't judge how well it was advertised, how many it reached, but we would have loved to have more meetings, if there would have been more, if the meetings would be over-brimming. And I can certainly say on the level of the faculty that I think the communications were adequate. And I have talked to a number of faculty who just also admitted that they didn't pay attention at that point in time. And I understand why that is. I mean, I don't always read every email either. But all I wanted to stress is that from our work, we were trying to do the work. And I also hear you that you're saying that you feel that, of course, that in some sense the conversation we had was much more hypothetical. There wasn't a concrete proposal. But in any case, processes can be improved, there's no question. But it wasn't designed to be, as you put it, that it flies under the radar. Certainly not from our perspective.
If people on the panel have questions of each other, that can be done too. But otherwise,
if you're in the process of revising the report and changing things, what would be really great is if the PIC report responds to the cascade of events that have occurred in this nation on campuses said, well, our vision is to stop and pause and ask for a year of reflection. When something is so in the DNA of this university, like the core, where we had a year of reflection on the core, and certainly can't teach the values of its own DNA of the university, and because of the turbulent rise and the context of which these pieces actually, wouldn't it behoove the PIC report to take a really courageous view of saying, we need more dialogue, we have to alter the procedure midway because of what's occurred, and say, we agree, it's not a concession. It's simply say, this matters so much, the campus is so loyal, that we think a year of reflection is necessary. So I call on you to take a report, not to fiddle with confidentiality, or fiddle with this, not to fiddle, but to say we think a broader engagement, dialogue, reflection is necessary because things are not as they were in the fall of 2016 on campus, nationally or internationally.
Just to speak to Amy's point up, we want to stress that there is a sense of urgency and emergency right now. That sense of urgency and emergency is not the one that has been framed by the Picker report, in which apparently there is a reason to be concerned with acts of protest on campus interfering with the life of the university. And we think it is in fact what Professor Stanley just mentioned that calls for an urgent response, which is a more nuanced and participatory and careful approach to this question of disciplining protest in light of the moment we live in. And I think that this was actually, if I understood correctly, Ken, this was precisely what he meant when he said that the sense of urgency might actually be counterproductive to discussing disciplinary action, right? And I think we know this. We know that a conversation cannot happen when that there is a sense of urgency and that it should happen hurriedly. And I would like to stress the fact that perhaps an administration-appointed committee is not the adequate mechanism through which to revise a disciplinary system at all, right? It might be that committees are constituted for different purposes, but I think what we're learning today and what we're learning as a result of this process is that a closed-door committee might actually, by design, lead to undesired outcomes. And so what that process looks like, and here at a university we sure know this, that by design a process can be excluding some who should be at the table, right? And so perhaps this conversation from the get-go, not that another committee is constituted or invited to, tell us what the next good iteration of the disciplinary system should be, but that in fact this discussion should be happening in the most open way, and the design of the process, let me reiterate that, the design of the process should include faculty, students, and staff. That's how we begin. And that's how we begin solidly and can own this process from the beginning until the end.
I assume at this point I'm supposed to say something, so that's what I'll do. So there's a lot there. My friend Amy, we spent a lot of time with soccer together, so we've spent a lot of time together. So let me try to deal with different pieces of that. So the openness of the process, I don't know really even how to speak to that in some sense. Chris gave a rendition of what we did. We were willing to meet with anyone who wanted to meet with us. So I don't, I don't know what that otherwise would mean. You can be suspicious of the administration. I don't feel that way, but so maybe I'm naive. You can tell me that. I don't feel that way. And if your view is that any committee appointed by the administration is inherently suspect and therefore their work needs to be rejected, I'll say I think that's inconsistent with University of Chicago values. University of Chicago values are, we look at the ideas. We don't look at the speaker. We don't question their motives. We examine the ideas. That is the heart of the University of Chicago. I have 3 degrees from the University of Chicago, from the college, from the econ department, and the law school. We wrestle with ideas. We don't attack speakers. I think that's actually really important. In terms of the era of reflection idea, we're going to have we have a disruptive conduct regime. I'm actually curious to see if the people in the room think we should not have that kind of regime. If you think it's appropriate to disrupt anything that occurs on campus. If you think it's appropriate to shout down campus speakers. We started this process. None of us know a lot about this on the committee. We started this by pulling together a list of case studies of situations on campus that we wanted to look at and understand. We saw 2 types of situations. One of those I'll call speech-speech conflicts. Classic example of that is Israeli Independence Day. A group of Israeli students reserve spot on the quads, on Bartlett Quad. Students for Justice in Palestine appear. That event gets shut down because of that interaction.
We think of that as a failure of free speech. I realize that's a contested idea. That's fine. It's going to be continually contested. That's what Ken said. He's right. It should be continually contested. Don't have any problem with that. But the alternative from the committee's perspective is that we simply have people yelling at each other and shutting people down. That seems unacceptable. We hope to do better than that. On that particular one, I hope education's going to work. We're going to reach out to registered student organizations and try to do better there. But I think that's that approach. That's one, speech. The other one is not a speech conflict, but is really a pure act of disruption. Those are two situations, where Levy Hall was taken over. Make a decision about that, right? Do you think there should be some circumstances under which we should prevent individuals from interrupting all of the activities that occur on campus, in the hospitals, in classrooms, in the administration building? My view is it's sensible to have a disruptive conduct regime. We can talk about the scope of that regime, absolutely. That's what we should do. But it certainly makes sense to have one, and we do have one. The issue in front of the council right now is which administrative procedure is going to apply to that, not whether one is. Is it going to be the 1970 procedures, or is it going to be some version of our revised procedures? That's the choice before the council. People will figure out what they want to do on that.
Questions?
I can speak up. So I'm just curious. I myself am an undergraduate, and I saw the flyers around, but had I not seen an article on DNA Info about this, I would not know, because those flyers are way too wordy, and I'm just really read it to actually understand what it's about. So I would disagree that it's been well marketed. I think he put it well that very few actual students who are primarily impacted by this disciplinary decision have actually been involved within this process. And I also just wanted to pose a question in regards to obviously the situation is there will be some sort of disciplinary system put in place for dissent and activism on this campus, but what is the consideration that that response is because the administration refuses to meet with their constituents and sort of address the situations that continually go on throughout campus? A lot of those dissents and instances come from that sort of feeling. So in what role will this sort of encourage that the administration be open and transparent to the public?
First, let me just say that the bad posters are the fault of the AAUP.
We had our own bad posters. Well, okay. Yeah, that's fine.
I want to go back to the point about what we do here and attacking ideas and not people, and just reiterate something that I made in my initial remarks in connection with something that was just brought up, namely that the Chicago principles, as enunciated in the Stone Report and in President Zimmer's speech, the one that we all got an email of a couple weeks ago, and in other public pronouncements, these are a very particular take on it. And this take on it has not been discussed. We have not debated it. And so this description of what we do seems, in this context, a little out of place. And the fact that we haven't makes one part of the Picker report that we haven't talked about seem especially problematic, and that is the educational part, the co-curricular education, it's called. I mean, it's not just a matter of, it's at the very end of the 30-page packet. It's the penultimate page where you see the recommendations. It's the fourth recommendation in the front of the packet. But it refers to, it's not just telling people what the rules are so they know when they're going to break them. It is a comprehensive attempt to inculcate a set of principles into people. So alongside the curriculum in biology, chemistry, economics, there will be a co-curriculum of freedom of expression. The former will be taught by professors, the latter will be taught by administrators. I don't know. I mean, the proposal seems to me to be that the administration itself should assume the role of moral political educator, and that strikes me as not only incompatible with the Calvin report, but much more appropriate to a Christian college or military academy than a research institution.
Hand over there.
There's one.
One over there.
Someone needs the microphone, let me know. Otherwise, just ask a question. But nobody wants to react to that.
Well, I'm happy to react, but I don't want to, I'm happy to react for the next 30 minutes, but I don't do that. So, do you want me to, whatever you want to do?
Well, I think I would like to hear your reaction.
Sure. So 2 things on that. So one is there's this discussion about, well, the faculty has not spoken. The disruptive conduct rules were adopted by the council in May of 2014. That's not the Stone report, but the actual language of disruptive conduct went exactly through the council. That's the most democratic faculty body we have. That's what the disciplinary regime is about, addressing that definition of disruptive conduct. So Ken can talk about what he did or didn't do as part of the Stone report. And Ken seems to be backing away from that a little bit. But okay, we're allowed to evolve. That's fair. I have no problem with that. We learn new things all the time, right? In terms of the education, boy, I hope everyone wants to participate in free speech education. So if Michelle Rasmussen can sign you up, she'll sign you up in a heartbeat.
Oh, yeah, can I add, backing away, I'm not sure whether it counts as that. Part of what I was trying to assert there was that on my view of the principles of the report, the commitment to freedom of inquiry, freedom of expression is necessarily processual, right? And but I'll actually I am saying on second thought, I do want to say a couple of things, because among the points that I think have been made in various ways here has been the question of the status of committee reports within the university and their role within university governance. And I think it's important to realize that this may be a necessarily broader reflection, because there was nothing unusual in what I can see in the procedures by which your committee proceeded. It actually reflected in some ways the processes, or I think probably exactly the processes that were used in terms of convening the committee that drafted the report on freedom of expression. We were appointed, we accepted, the announcement of the committee was sent out to the university community with the charge. We then set up a variety of meetings relying on university staff people to get us in touch with the various constituencies that we thought would be appropriate. The report was drafted. A draft was submitted to the administration. We reflected on it. We said we were done. We sent it up, and I thought, well, there'll be further discussion. And apparently, this is not unusual for these kinds of reports. One of the reasons that we actually established the AAUP Advocacy chapter is that we're very much concerned that the principle of faculty governance is something that needs a lot of review, because I think a lot of things happen that are ostensibly being done by faculty in the name of the faculty that many faculty members are unaware of for just the reasons: too many emails to read and too short of time to respond to. So the other reports that Anton mentioned, for example, the Calvin report, I think is probably as exemplary of university processes as the Stone report. These things acquire a kind of sacrosanct quality by virtue of the process by which they get referenced.
When do we become sacrosanct? Is that another 5 minutes or what?
For the Picker report? It depends, right?
Yes,
it depends. 5 years from now, this is a concern. So, I do think that we need to have a broader discussion, and in the AAUP Advocacy chapter, this is what we do want to do, about what faculty governance actually means, and how to think about these reports. It might be, and I'm going on a little longer than I want it to be, it might be the case that what we should move towards is a process by which the proposal to establish a committee is actually debated before a committee is constituted, as such that there's a debate about the appointment of faculty to these committees beforehand, and that there is an explicit understanding of the process by which a committee report will become this report, or just an effort to sort of think things through that we decided we didn't need a report for at the, so there are a lot of things I think that can be talked about here that are, I think, at issue because of the importance of the particular concerns and the immediacy of these concerns, but go more broadly to the question of what does it mean to have an institution run on behalf of its constituencies. And so I was going to conclude. Anton raised the point about the Stone report saying that its animating concern was protecting the speech of outsiders. It wasn't its animating concern. The animating concern was how to protect the speech of those inside the institution. That it becomes, and I think the reading that Anton gives of the report is that it becomes clearer, it's clearer in terms of how it works in that way, is I think a reflect of, maybe the kinds of assumptions that we thought we were examining fully in putting together the report. Our animating concern was how to affirm the values of freedom of expression for all members of a campus constituency. If our report didn't do it, it wasn't because we didn't want to do it. I'm not going to argue that we did by any means, because I do think in subsequent discussions of what the report does well, what it does less well, I think the critique that Anton makes is a valid one. But it seems to show that what one's animating concerns are under a certain set of operating principles may need to be subject to further discussion and further review.
Yes, I see a lot of hands, but I saw you first.
So this is a question, I think, for Randy or Priscilla. Happy to hear what anybody thinks. I guess I'm just eager to hear what you guys think is the actual problem facing the University of Chicago in particular vis-a-vis protest and speech, because obviously you think that there is one, otherwise you wouldn't have made all of these proposals. But it's not contained, it's certainly not made clear within the report. And based on the examples that you just gave, you sort of did a thing where you named one of the most contentious socio-political issues facing the United States, or facing the globe, and acted a little surprised that it ramifies in complex ways on our campus. I don't think that entitles you to a certain rhetoric of moral panic, right, which is what I think you did afterwards, which was to sort of suggest that there's a kind of deluge of problems facing us that are exemplified by that. I don't think that's true. I'd like to hear, if you do think that's true, I'd like to hear why, but I think perhaps more to the point, in my mind, is that this is a sort of response to what you were just saying. I think that the Diversity Advisory Committee offers a really powerful template for how to address precisely this question, which is how do we find out what kinds of actual problems are existing on our campus, right? What is it that is the nature of the problem? And in that case, given the sort of widespread perception that our campus was failing to live up to our values of inclusivity and non-discrimination, we've been on an over a year-long process of social scientific fact-finding, of surveys, of analysis of the survey results, of multiple fora for community meetings with all of the different schools and divisions represented. We're having more of them next week. We had them in the winter, right? I don't think that there isn't a template or a model for a kind of rigorous U-Chicago-style intellectual inquiry into what kinds of problems we're actually facing. And I don't really understand how we can move forward on this most complex of issues before we know. And I don't think that that's the sort of, I don't think that the committee, I think, I'm sure you guys have thought about just this question quite a bit, but I don't think it's the sort of question that can be answered by a committee. It requires this kind of widespread community input.
Katie, what do you want to do?
I think Randy probably will have his answer. I mean, for me, let me give two answers. One is that, so we looked at 7, 8, or 9 case studies. Some of them are connected to the IOP, some of them were speakers at the International House, and then some of the incidents that Randy referenced. So I would not characterize it as a deluge. I don't think anyone would have done that. I think that's also, to a certain extent, a mischaracterization of how we would put it. Now, I do think that, again, and we can disagree with this, the university has taken a very strong, or our leadership has taken a very strong position, and those of us who, if we see the Stone report as representing our principles, and I know this is now contested, it was not contested when it came out, now we're having a conversation about it, and so there we have a very strong position, and so, I think the feeling, or my feeling, I can't speak for every committee member, is that, all eyes are going to be on us if there is, if something like Berkeley or Middlebury or happens, and we should have a set of rules in place if we have sort of a breakdown of our culture of free expression and inquiry. Now, again, you can debate that, but that was sort of, say, our rationale. Now, obviously this was something that I also had read in the responses. I do think that the climate survey is of a different type, and I don't think in the sense of, we're talking about, so to say, big incidents. Now, one effect, I grant you, of disciplinary system could be sort of the microscopic chilling effect that, of course, many are concerned about, and I think that's a very valid concern, and that's what the climate survey is trying to assess. But we're not dealing, so to say, with that. I don't know what the standard, the social scientific standard is when we're looking at those big, not singular, but so to say, exposed incidents are, and I think that's what we're, what we are trying to address. So I think, or it's my sense that those are different, so to say, ways of going about it, and different ways of characterizing and getting at the problem.
I understand that, but I would just like, of the 9 things that we looked at, how many of them would be relevant to the Diversity Advisory Committee's report, right? Because I think that to try and disaggregate these 2 concerns on campus is a really aggressive sort of rhetorical move, right? How many of the issues that you guys are considering are things that have to do as well with discrimination, racism, misogyny, homophobia, and sexism on campus? Certainly, for example, the Anita Alvarez incident is, right? That's not, people were not protesting her based on what she has said, but on what she has done in the Chicago community, right? So I think this is a really, I hear what you're saying, but I think it seems to me that there's a kind of, a different bar being set for the questions about discrimination than there are about these sort of hot button issues that you're talking about, even though in many cases they would be the same issues or the same event that would be relevant.
See, I'll say I don't understand the institutional design principle that I saw this in the U of C Resist document, which is the idea seems to be you should wait for a really bad event on your campus and then respond in the context of that, rather than trying to think about this removed from that kind of event. So
that's just anxiety about what it's what we think we're
okay. We have a regime in place. It's either the 1970 regime or the new one. So somehow you seem to think you can live outside that regime. I don't think that's going to be where we're going to be over the next 3 years on this campus. Okay, I was trying to make sure we all saw the choice that was in front of us. It's not a choice between acting and not acting. It's a choice between 1970 and the proposed revisions.
I would like to speak to that very briefly, Lulu, because I think that Professor Picker is presenting us with a false dichotomy. And if I may say so myself, given I'm a lawyer, I will put on my lawyer hat for a second. And I don't think that what we're discussing here is either the Picker report or let's just completely scrap any disciplinary regime. I think that that wouldn't benefit anyone on this campus. But we do think that the option, that presenting the option in those terms is already framing the question in a particular way. And also it's a disavowal of the history of the 1970s regime itself, which interestingly, I've learned through this process, is the result of sometimes contentious dialogue between faculty, students, and the administration. And the beauty of that process, its complicated nature, is that in fact it was the faculty senate retained gained its competency to decide on all disciplinary transformations all transformations to the disciplinary regime because students were fighting for it. In ways that, it might have been that the students at the time were not happy about it. But gosh, am I happy today that the Faculty Senate has a say on this matter, and on May 23rd, the council will have a vote. So I think that here, there is a legacy of protest that is in fact inherent, imminent to the 1970s regime, that makes the question that makes the framing of the question as an all or nothing, right? And that makes the disavowal of the 1970s regime too rushed. And I think we need to look more closely at the 1970s regime, because the truth is that in some respects, the Pickett report makes the 1970s regime look good. And that in and of itself is problematic. So let's move the other, and I want to say just quickly, where do we move from here now? So we know, we have been discussing, and we all, I think, at the table and perhaps in the audience can agree that the committee acted in good faith, that the committee, like many other people sitting today in this room, are committed to a stronger protest and stronger voice within the university, and that we're all committed to a project of shared governance. Now we have been hearing for weeks now from students and faculty that we want a different type of process. So let's move forward and think together about that process and think ahead instead of continuing to justify what the committee did and how it did it. I think we can move forward from where we are now.
No, I'm happy to talk, but there are a bunch of hands. He's been waiting a while.
But the microphone is there so you go first and then go back to the microphone.
Maybe we can have a couple.
Whatever you guys want to do.
A couple of voices and then.
Sure.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
So I want to follow up. I mean, it's on a bunch of threads that have been running through this whole discussion, but specifically, Professor Wild mentioned a kind of distinction between exposed incidents and other kinds of incidents and concerns. And I just want to pick up on the nature of that exposure a little bit, because I think one of the things that makes this so complicated, and our readings of this will differ depending on the level of trust we have in the administration, but one of the things that makes it so complicated is that on one hand, this looks like an issue that's facing us as a community that we need to evaluate as a community within ourselves about how we conduct ourselves. But on the other hand, it seems like what's at stake is not at stake for this community at all, but rather for certain people. I don't think they're in this room. Like our president, who writes columns in newspapers like the Wall Street Journal, gives speeches at other colleges in which he invokes his status as the leader of this institution to call upon these so-called Chicago principles as part of what seems to be a kind of branding campaign. Again, our readings may differ on that, but in any case, the number of institutions that have picked up this phrase Chicago principles is sign enough, and the number of op-eds that have been headed by prominent figures in major newspapers is evidence enough that now there's a real stake, as Professor Wadi also mentioned, that if all eyes are on us anyway, if we do have this kind of incident that you were talking about, a very large community is going to be watching, and it seems to me that the university administration, regardless of how, I agree that this committee seems to have operated in good faith, but the university administration has a stake in this university projecting a certain kind of aura about freedom of speech and expression and exchange of ideas, and that state may be motivating what feels to me like a rushed, non-transparent process. And I know that concern is shared by other people in the sense that in order to do something that really impacts people at the very top of the administrative structure and a much wider network of consumers of the ideas of the Chicago principles, that we're sort of being used as a prop in that. And that's a really strong feeling of mistrust.
Let's indeed get a couple of responses. I want to actually add a couple of comments and then a response. I want to echo that too. We tried to invite President Zimmer and Provost Biermeier, and that didn't work out. But I've also been disappointed that these reports come out, but they're sort of sent to the faculty, and then the president goes on a tour, and then you hear about it when you're watching Meet the Press on Sunday morning or something. Okay. And I just feel that if the campus should own this, then the president should engage the faculty, should engage the student and the student body, and that has not happened. And that makes the reception of this draft report also more difficult, I think, for people like myself on council. But let's get a few more comments. Yes, please.
Yeah, I know exactly what Sammy said. And I want to, so the person Anton, the person Everett, Alejandra, understand most of the people here putting this report and these reports in the context of the national conversation, in the context of history, and Professor Picker, Professor Wells, what I heard from you, is putting it in the context of this idea of what we are as a school, what we protect, what kind of speech we protect, our sort of freedom of inquiry, and they seem very sort of separate to me. You have an idea of what you want this document to achieve, and that's why you've done what you've done. And we encourage you to say again and again why we're doing that. But we haven't really encouraged you to engage with the things that Anton and Everett both said at the beginning of this talk about, first of all, the effect that this has had in the national landscape. The fact that the Chicago principles are being used to hold up right-wing laws that smash like dissent and protest on campuses across the country. The fact that this is happening at the same time that over 200 people who protested at the inauguration are facing over 70 years in prison and 8 felonies for being in the vicinity of windows being smashed. And you can't pull these apart, especially in our current political climate, especially with our current president. And you can't pull them apart from the history of dissent that has made this institution a better, more diverse place. And you can't pull it apart from racist, homophobic incidents on campus. You can't pull it apart from the fact that a non-tenured professor said that he or she or them did not feel comfortable expressing their ideas, which completely counter the values and ideologies that you have expressed this document, especially in the body. So I was wondering if you guys could speak to that, speak to the fact that the effect of this document is making people scared to speak, which you counter the idea that that's making people, helping these laws get passed and preventing the kind of speech that makes our institution a better place.
One more comment, because you have a comment.
Yeah, so just to clarify though, I have a separate question, but just to your last point, we're not sure if the professor was afraid to speak because of backlash from the university or because they might look back at students and backlash from students. So we don't know. All that Professor Ford mentioned was like they were afraid to speak. Oh, okay.
Huge backlash from the administration.
Okay, all right.
Fact-finding mission.
Yeah, I mean, I can ask a question after that one's going to apply to, or whatever.
Well, we have a couple of questions. So do you want to?
Go ahead.
This is a question for Everett. But so you kind of framed your argument in terms of we have this great history of protest being really, really powerful and really, really useful at the University of Chicago in promoting various causes that we would all support. And then one of the things that you said is that there has been a crackdown on protests at UChicago. And I'm curious if you could give some examples of that. I think I would be really grateful in terms of so we all know what we're talking about. Because a lot of what I see on campus campus. I'm personally not a member of UFC Resist. I have been on protests outside of the university. But what I see is the actual protests happening and happening very frequently and supporting a lot of various issues that protesters care about. But I never see the aftermath. Like, I don't know if there is a crackdown that happened on those protesters. I don't know what happened to them. I don't know what happened with the event that they were protesting or whatever. And so I think it would be useful because a lot of the things that we're talking about is student groups protesting other student groups. But what you mentioned was like the university, cracking down on those student groups. So can you maybe just give a couple of examples of what we're talking about?
Do you want to start?
Do you want me to start? Sure. Yeah. Well, Tyler Kissinger just last year, and the administrative effort to, intervene after the protest at Levy Hall last year. But again, this is about like institutional memory. Just a couple years ago, the students who were beaten by UCPD during the Trauma Center Coalition, the protests at the hospital, the lockdown of the construction site, when you're as a student you're beaten by the UCPD force that is supposed to be protecting you, it seems like a pretty harsh crackdown on protest. But again, it's the crackdown on dissent and protest. It's not always material in that sense. It's the documents, the discourse, the literature of the Chicago principles that are used to tell students here that's not how you're supposed to go about expressing yourself, right? Where ironically the discourse on the Chicago principles, the literature of the Chicago principles is held up and whipped out of our back pockets to suppress conversation about the Chicago principles as opposed to fostering free speech. We hear all the time that this campus is a politically neutral space. This institution is politically neutral because the Calvin Report essentially created this idea of political neutrality, which is, we have to, these are live documents and we have to contest those ideas. I don't know if that responded to your...
And are those incidents that you mentioned, like the Trauma Center and Tyler Kissinger, were those part of the 7 or 8 case studies that were used as the basis of the report?
Certainly the Tyler Kissinger one was, yes.
Okay.
So we can talk about that, but we don't have time.
I would also add sometimes it's less clear. For instance, Students for Justice in Palestine were harassed multiple times over the past couple years. Their information was revealed online, and the administration did not step in to protect them, right? So that's a case where non-action was used to suppress student activity and student political activity on campus.
Can I just add one thing to that? I wouldn't quite characterize it as suppression, but it does. But the non-action around that incident, when our students their free expression was impinged on, but because they were being attacked by the Horowitz Institute personally, and when that happened, there was no op-ed in the New York Times. Like, the weird thing is, when I said before that I think, the thrust of whatever is being projected into the world about the Chicago principles is all about protecting very important people who want to use universities as platforms, and not at all about protecting students, staff, and faculty. If you doubt that, then here's a challenge. Find me an example of either Zimmer or some other officer of the university going out of their way to defend the free expression of a student, either on this campus or on any other campus. In the Oberlin speech, or whatever it was, Colgate speech, there are like a half a dozen incidents on a half a dozen campuses. The people whose speech he's worried about, each and every one of them, is a dignitary. It's Laura Bush, Henry Kissinger, people like this. No students. The only time the freedom of speech flag gets waved in public is to criticize students. Like, was there an op-ed when Stephen Salai was losing his job? No. Was there an op-ed about the fact that people are losing, that the tenure system is being eroded? No. I mean, during Occupy, when students were being pepper sprayed by police at UC Davis, were we reading from the president about freedom of expression? No. This is the thing. It's applied in this. This flag is never flown for students or faculty. It's only, it's only for these other people.
I'm glad we wanted to get in. We had two earlier questions that Sylvie did not answer about why the president is not engaged in the state community, right? And why is he talking elsewhere and not here?
We're not in charge of that. So I don't know who is, but we're not in charge of that. So.
I mean,
shake your head at me, Elaine. I don't understand what that means. Oh, okay. Well, I saw a lot of head shaking. Go ahead, please. Sure.
It was not that I was not suggesting that you were colluding with this agenda in any way.
I wasn't taking it that way, but
I was asking you to reflect on the fact that this report has a life outside of the university and being used to leverage goals that are not your goals in writing this report.
Yeah, I don't.
That as a political utility for somebody else, and that you wrote this document and now it's being used that way, or you're participating in a tradition of talking about Chicago principles and now it's being used that way. And I just wanted to hear what you thought.
I mean, look, if I can jump in here, is just like with the Stone report, that when the committee was working on it, no one really cared. As I indicated, not many people cared when we were working on it. I do have to say that it crossed my mind that could, I have, you may see it differently. You're shaking your head. I'm sorry that I'm responding directly. But we didn't get the feeling that there was a lot of concern out there about that at the time. And I understand why this has changed, and it's it's not difficult to understand. But so just to add to respond to your question, has it crossed my mind? I mean, obviously it crossed my mind at some point that in some sense, I sometimes joke that the Stone committee had it easy, and we had actually the really hard, because ours is about, so to say, application of principles. You can articulate, sort of ideals in an abstract realm, and then when it sort of comes to the rubber hits the road, that's where it gets difficult. So it crossed my mind, but as I said, it's one of those things where the environment changed around us. And one thing that I do want to talk about, because you were talking about branding, and look, I think I'm not naive we are aware that that's part of the Chicago brand, and that Chicago brand is also, of course, President Zimmer is working hard on that. I don't always agree with that as a faculty member, but there's also parts that I agree with. And so, only because somebody else is working on a brand, I'm not going to sort of separate myself from those parts that I actually can agree with. And just another point that I briefly want to make, and this is a larger point, is that has to do with, of course, the co-optation of the right of certain things that have been held more dear to the left. My first job was at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I had a faculty member who came into the crossfire for teaching courses and having a research program that did not sit well with conservative, even if it was at that time in Democratic hands, state legislature. And so, what I'm trying to say is that these things change, and we're at a point where we feel, I think many of us feel, to a certain extent, sort of say, helpless by the fact that we have these certain principles, and suddenly they're appearing on the other side of the spectrum. Well, what do we do now with it? And obviously, one of the things that we're doing is having these conversations, but I don't think there's an easy answer, and it doesn't invalidate just simply these principles or these values that we hold dear because they appear on the other side. We have to find a way then to negotiate that. I don't necessarily have an answer to that, but I recognize it, but I also think that it's not an easy, so to say, critique by basically saying, well, look, here's the Goldwater Institute and it's using this, and thereby we need to abandon it. I don't think so. I think it's harder than that. But I'm not sure that, as I said, that I have a simple blueprint of how to move forward on that.
I think ideas matter. Well, why else would we be at universities if we didn't believe that? I basically, other than practicing law for 4 years, spent my whole life in universities, and most of it at this university. So I think ideas matter. I think that's good. I think that's important. We should stop doing what we're doing if we don't believe it. We should just stop. The key is to get the ideas right. That's hard. I mean, we do scholarship. Scholarship is super hard. So the goal here is to get the ideas right, and in this particular situation, to do better than the past. But that's all we can try to do. I mean, I don't know what else we might do. Please.
I'm allowed to shake my head and I'm frustrated.
That's fine. I'm allowed to react. We both get to do that. Go ahead.
Okay. The thing that I continue to have this problem with, I'm a member of you hear this heartfelt account of how people have been frustrated. And I keep on hearing back from you, and I totally understand from a personal standpoint why you want to say this. You're sick to death of this, you put a lot of time into it, you want to be done with it. I get that. But the fact is that you can't do it. Or we can't do it. And so you keep on referring back to what I consider to be a procedural approach. It's either 1970 or it's this new report. And in some sense, that's right. We as a committee are being forced into making that decision. And I'm not saying you're forcing us. I'm saying circumstances produce a situation or report. And then immediately in that context, you say, well, we're going to do something where there's no disciplinary regime at all. And I don't think that's where anybody is. I mean, some people may feel that, and may have a principled stance in relation to that. But it seems to make this incredibly murky. The problem is that a lot of people have not been included in the conversation, A. B, things have changed over the last year. You started convening in October, an important month. Things have changed in the environment of the large university world. I get your point, Chris, that the other side is not just about the Fulbrights, it's not just about the Albright. But all of that has been reframed in a new way in the last year. People are waking up and starting to pay attention all over the country. Would you say to people who are now wanting to sign more people up to vote so they can change the disposition of the Congress, for instance, in 2018, that, it's too late because you weren't paying attention earlier? It's a good thing that people are paying attention now. And I don't understand the resistance that some of you on the committee, I'm not saying all, and the university have to slowing this down so that larger portions of the community participate. I just don't, in the end, that last bit, I just don't get. That's why I'm shaking my head.
Could I respond to that briefly?
No, please. No, go ahead.
I think that I think that last comment is a very important one, because another way of reading, I read your fatigue and your exasperation and the fact that you have worked hard on this. And this is precisely, I think, the way that this conversation appears to be set up, as if you're the bad guys and the rest of us are the good guys, is already a conversation that is structured by the erosion of tenure and by the fact that university governance rests increasingly so on people who are not the people sitting today in this room, not at this table, but in this room. And so what's really important for us today is to remember that, in fact, this pushback is a unique opportunity. It's a unique opportunity for faculty and students and hopefully staff to come together and have a different kind of conversation. So I know it feels frustrating because a lot of work has been put into it, but I think the Picker Report is an opportunity as it stands today. Perhaps not an opportunity that will an opportunity if we don't rush into voting it. And the UCR, UFC Resist, is a very interesting platform because it's the first platform that from the get-go is being constituted to bring faculty, staff, and community together. And it is in that spirit that we came to this, that we drafted this letter a while ago. And we're hoping that what comes through, right, what we can do is keep sitting at the table. But I think that the table needs to be reorganized for us to actually, we're having the conversation now. I think we're actually having the tough conversation. We just need to keep having it for a while before we can make any decision. That's why we urge members of the council to not pass the Picker report, not to throw it out the window, but to make it the starting point of what we hope will be a conversation of which you will be part of as people who have put a lot of work into this.
How long are we running?
About 5 minutes.
Okay. So I guess Elaine's question. So part of this is clearly about the fact that this is directly in the hands of the council. That has consequences. So there was this discussion about the comparison to Adam Green's process. Nothing, I think, there actually has to be voted on by the council. Certainly we heard it in the council, but nothing was voted on. The fact that this has to be voted on by the council means that the council turns over, basically as of March 24th. There's a council that understands this issue. Next year's council will be a completely different council that will have to go through this issue again. That's a version of Groundhog Day, a version of hell in my view. That's a different discussion. Decide how you feel about that. But I'm not hearing any natural limiting principle to this, well, we should have more time. And that I need to hear something that would articulate a limiting principle to that. As Chris said, we've been talking to people for the last year. That's a lot of time.
I mean, can I just also, I think I welcome, the council, it is in the hands of the council. And one of the things that I found actually very encouraging, as you remember, Elaine, you were also a member of the council, is that council meeting where it was on the agenda, the first time was the best attended council meeting that I can remember. People came, and one of the things that I do feel is that the Council of the University Senate isn't a body that is a real deliberative body. Now, there's lots of factors to diagnose here, and that would take now longer. But certainly, it is now, people are paying attention, and I hope that it will in full force and people will vote on it. And in that sense, maybe that will also then, and again, this is, you will not be sort of say happy about me putting it that way, but the point is this, maybe this will also prompt people to take the council more seriously, because I can tell you it's hard to recruit people for the council. I do it every year. I try to recruit people for the council to serve on the council, and people are not really interested. And I think we need to be more interested. So I completely agree.
But 90% of the council work is voting on letterhead, honorary degrees, and things that most of the council can't really purposely weigh in on because it's curriculum specific to some division they don't know. So and also I have been finding the actual minutes spent thus far on discussing this document in the council. I would, you would be surprised to hear how it goes. It's 21 minutes. Wow.
Oh no, I'm sure that's not right.
Our last meeting was half an hour, more than half of that time was taken up by you talking.
Oh, okay, but that's part of that's fine. You may decide you don't want to listen to me, and I completely get that. That is part of the process of how things get done in the council. So I've been in front of the council 3 times. I think the first one ran 40 minutes. I'll say 30 minutes on the other 2. That's fine. I'm happy not to talk. I'm really happy not to talk. Well, okay.
I can only say that I would have also welcomed much more time.
We have not yet answered your question about how things have changed in the past year, and actually that Jane had that too, and how that would affect the discussion, right?
Yes. And it actually was something you said after I asked the question, which is that ideas matter, and ideas matter. I agree wholeheartedly. Ideas matter a lot because ideas move people's actions, and your ideas have moved
nationally people's action to create laws that limit the amount of...
Ken's, not mine, it's Ken's.
That is our president's action to defend the sort of free speech rights of dignitaries, Laura Bush, of, these sorts of important people. They moved people's action to create laws that limit protest, and they have not moved people's action to protect the rights to use other type of pictures. And I think...
But do you think...
I haven't heard either of you comment. I haven't heard any of you comment on the fact that these ideas, like, because the big report is suggestions to implement the ideas of the Stone report. So these ideas have moved people to these actions. And I haven't heard any of you comment on the fact that those ideas have moved people to those specific actions that have not moved people to the action of defending the rights of students.
I know you're addressing this to Randy and Chris, but yeah, I think the force or part of what I wanted to say was that what we have seen as a result of the Stone Report is the way in which, I mentioned the Tennessee legislature, but as Anton indicated, you can mention other places. The deep irony of the FIRE campaign was its assertion that it was a good thing to have a statement of freedom of expression, for a campus to have a statement of freedom of expression, before we had any evidence that it was a good thing for this campus to have a statement of freedom of expression. That is to say, as soon as the report was issued, it was already a part of that campaign, urging campuses that it's a good thing to have one. I mean, if we're thinking about the principles that we represent here at the University of Chicago, we would have said, well, we don't know yet. We think it's a good thing to have one. We just issued one. Let's see what difference it makes in terms of how we operate on this campus, how it helps us adjudicate conflicts that will come up, as to whether having a statement's a good thing or having the particular statement that we have. What happened immediately subsequent to the issuing of the report is that it became Exhibit A in what campuses ought to do, before there was any evidence that it really was what campuses ought to do. To the extent that, I entered the discussion not entirely convinced that we needed one, which is a different thing from saying that some of the principles expressed in the statement aren't good principles. I think many of the principles are good principles. We had existed as an institution for more than 100 years without a statement of freedom of expression as such. There was no reason necessarily to believe that we could not have existed for another 100 years without such a statement, as long as a community we felt, and the evidence indicated that the values that we held were being properly implemented and upheld. What we are now, I think, in the wake of, and Randy and Chris, I think Chris is right. In some respects, drafting the statement was probably the easier thing. Seeing exactly how to deal with the effects of it, that's the hard part of it. So what we're seeing now is, in some sense, a representation of, and I do feel that, and I appreciate, having been on one of these committees, how much work one does. It's above and beyond what, other things that you have to do. And it would be nice to believe that there is a kind of targeting, where you can say at a certain moment we feel we have, and there's debated and deliberated enough, and it's time to make a determination. But I do think a determination not to make a determination is a determination, right? That is to say, it might be the case that, I would have been happy, I think, although I was persuaded that on balance having a statement was a good thing, but we'd have to see. And part of what I'm saying today is that, well, in the part of the process that we have to see, some of my reservations in the decision process have been realized more so than allayed. And I do think that the urgency, the felt urgency of the moment is a detriment right now to, I think, reaching a policy that will be a good thing for this institution as a whole.
I think on that note, we're running a little over time. It's good to end the discussion. So I want to thank you all for participating, and especially thank all the panel members for their interest.